The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song as Laura Bennett moved through Oak Creek Memorial's pediatric ward, her civilian scrubs a perfect disguise for the woman beneath. A nurse. That's all anyone saw. Not the way her hands never trembled during foreplacement. Not the combat medic's efficiency in every gesture. Not the legend of Marjah that lived in the scar tissue of her soul. He didn't know. None of them knew. She arrived for her shift at 6 in the morning, Savannah's humidity already pressing against the hospital windows like something alive. The antiseptic smell hit her first, that sharp chemical bloom that never quite masked the underneath scent of human suffering and industrial bleach. It triggered memories she'd spent for years learning to push down. Muscle memory tried to activate. Breathing exercises. Ground yourself. Name 5 things you can see. Don't let it pull you under again. The locker room was empty at this hour. Laura opened her assigned locker and immediately saw it, the faded unit patch she'd sewn into the jacket lining 3 months ago, back when she still couldn't throw away the last physical proof of who she'd been. Coast Guard insignia. A call sign stitched in fading blue thread, Beacon. Her hands traced the fabric without thinking, a ritual as automatic as her daughter asking for breakfast. She pulled her hands back. Closed the locker. Checked her reflection in the warped mirror, hair in a neat bun, no makeup, the kind of invisible appearance that made her disappear into hospital corridors like a ghost in scrubs. The scars on her hands were faint now, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. Burn marks from 2009. Shrapnel traces from 2011. A long thin line across her left palm from a field surgery she'd performed on herself when there was no one else qualified. 12 years of Coast Guard service had written itself into her skin, and 4 years of civilian nursing hadn't erased a word. She pulled on latex gloves. The scars disappeared. That was the point. Room 304 was on the west corridor, pediatric intensive care, where the quietest desperation lived. Laura had learned early that parents sitting vigil all night developed a particular kind of exhaustion, not the regular tired of sleep deprivation, but the bone-deep hollow of hope being slowly drained. She could see it in Commander Derek Hayes the moment she approached his son's bedside. He sat in the uncomfortable chair they provided for families, the kind designed to be temporary, though everyone knew some parents never left. His civilian polo shirt was wrinkled, navy blue, expensive once. His jaw was shaved with military precision even now, even after what must have been a sleepless night. Laura's breath caught for just a fraction of a second before she controlled it. She knew that jaw. She'd saluted that man once, in another life, when she was still whole. Marcus Hayes lay motionless in the pediatric bed, the machinery around him painting the clinical picture in beeping counterpoint. Ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, monitors flashed their steady vital signs, for lines ran their clear fluid highways into his small arms. The boy was 10 years old according to the chart, angular limbs sprawled across white sheets, dark hair matted against the pillow. He looked like he was sleeping. That was the cruelest part of comas. They looked like sleep. They looked like they might wake up if you just waited long enough, believed hard enough, loved hard enough. The boating accident had happened 6 days ago. Recreational. A Sunday afternoon on the Wilmington River that had turned into a Coast Guard rescue operation by 2:56 p.m., when Marcus's small sailboat capsized and the boy went under for 3 minutes, maybe more. Nobody knew the exact timing anymore. The doctors had their story now: hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Brain death. Terminal prognosis. 3 minutes without oxygen was supposed to be the line where the person you loved crossed into something else. Some version of alive that wasn't really alive at all. Laura pulled up Marcus's chart on the tablet, and her jaw tightened reflexively as she scrolled. 10 different physicians had consulted on the case. 10 different opinions, and they all converged on the same brutal consensus: withdraw life support. Let him go. Stop the machines. Accept what had already happened. Dr. Sterling had written the most recent note, his signature aggressive across the digital signature field. Prognosis remains grave. Recommend family discussion regarding comfort care transition. Recommend discussion regarding withdrawal of life support. No meaningful recovery anticipated given extent of hypoxic injury and current neurostatus. The clinical language was calculated to sound gentle. It failed. What it actually said was, "Your son is dead, you're just waiting for his heart to stop beating." Laura had seen a lot of dead children in her career. Not enough time for this to be normal, never enough time for that. But she'd learned that dead and dying were not the same category, and 10 doctors could be wrong about which category you occupied. She'd learned this in Marjah. She'd learned it watching men come back who should have died, and watched men die who should have come back. Medicine was not mathematics. The numbers did not always work the way they were supposed to. She adjusted Marcus's for with unusual precision, her fingers moving through the muscle memory of someone who had done this in field conditions, with limited light, with incoming fire, with the knowledge that the person beneath her hands represented the only choice between death and something else. Before hung at exactly the right angle. No kinks. Perfect flow rate. Her hands never trembled. Commander Hayes stirred in the chair. His eyes opened, and for a moment he just watched her work, the economy of her movement, the absolute concentration, something in her bearing that didn't match the scrubs or the name tag that read simply, "Well, Bennett, RN." Recognition started to flicker in his expression, then dimmed. It had been 9 years since she served under him. She'd been a different rank then, a different version of herself. The woman who existed before Marjah. The woman who still believed that competence was enough to save you. "Good morning, Commander," Laura said, her voice kept carefully neutral, deferential in the way of civilian nurses speaking to military families. "I'm going to be Marcus's nurse today. I've read through his chart." Hayes nodded slowly, the weight of sleeplessness settling heavier on his shoulders. "The neurologist came by last night. Dr. Sterling. He was clear about the prognosis." Hayes's voice was the voice of a military man following orders from medicine, the same way he might follow any chain of command. "Accept the intelligence. Process the data. Make the decision. Don't let emotion interfere." "I understand," Laura said. She didn't tell him what she thought about 10 doctors and their unified prognosis. She didn't tell him that she'd seen impossible things happen in ICUs, in field hospitals, in places where medicine became less a science and more an act of will. She didn't tell him that sometimes the person sitting at a bedside, the one doing the quiet work nobody noticed, was the difference between surrender and something else. She was adjusting the monitor leads when Dr. Sterling arrived, and it took every ounce of her discipline not to betray what she'd just realized. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of confident build that came from tennis twice a week and a personal trainer who cost more per month than some people's mortgages. His watch was a Rolex, the kind that announced itself. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent light like a mirror. His eyes calculated everything they touched, the value of the bed, the trajectory of his career, the calculation of exactly how disposable this child was to his timeline. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the machines. "Senior Chief," he said, and Laura's breath stopped in a way she controlled before it became visible. He'd called her by rank. But that wasn't possible. Nobody here knew. She'd been careful. For years of careful. For years of being nobody. For years of scrubs and invisible hands and a voice that asked permission before it did anything. Then Dr. Sterling glanced at the name tag, at her face, and his expression shifted into something else entirely. A joke to himself. "Bennett," he said, reading the surname. "Good. We'll need someone reliable on this case. Someone who won't question the clinical consensus. Someone who understands that hope is a beautiful thing but it's not medicine." His smile was the smile of a man who'd never been questioned. Never been wrong. Never met anyone who'd seen what he'd seen and survived it anyway. Laura stood perfectly still. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the deference of a civilian nurse speaking to a chief physician. "Yes, doctor," she said. "When would you like me to talk with the family about comfort care options?" That was the moment she should have known something was coming. That was the moment the universe should have sent a warning in the form of thunder or static or some kind of signal that said, "Here, this is where everything changes." But there was nothing. Just the ventilator wheeze. Just the steady beep of the monitor. Just the sound of a man walking away confident in his authority, and a woman standing in scrubs with 9 years of combat medicine locked inside her chest, looking down at a child whose father had learned to stop hoping because 10 doctors had told him hope was professionally irresponsible. The next words out of Dr. Sterling's mouth, as he turned back in the doorway, changed everything. "We'll schedule the family conference for tomorrow morning," he said. "Get the paperwork ready. This one's done." Dr. Sterling stood at the nurse's station on Laura's second day, his voice pitched loud enough to carry through the pediatric ward. The fluorescent lights cast everything in hospital white, the charts, the walls, the forced smile spreading across his face. "I'm giving this one a week," he announced, gesturing toward Laura without looking at her directly. Nervous laughter rippled through the staff like a contagion nobody wanted but couldn't refuse. $10 says she quits before she has to clean up after another hopeless case. The words landed soft as a knife slipping between ribs. Laura stood 3 feet away, restocking for supplies with movements precise as a metronome. She took one measured breath through her nose. Said nothing. Didn't turn around. The laughter died. Sterling's smile widened, the smile of a man unused to silence, interpreting it as weakness. Commander Hayes appeared in the doorway of Marcus's room, having heard every word. His jaw tightened. He watched Laura for a moment, then retreated back to his son's bedside without speaking. The cafeteria the next morning was crowded with the 6 a.m. shift change, nurses rotating in, residents grabbing coffee they'd spilled before they finished it, dietary staff loading trays. Laura sat alone at a corner table, her scrambled eggs cooling on the plate in front of her. She wasn't thinking about Sterling's bet. She was thinking about the chart notation from the night shift: no improvement in brainstem reflexes, recommend family discussion withdrawal of support. 10 doctors. 10 identical recommendations. The pattern was a splinter she couldn't get out. Sterling appeared like a shadow cast by something larger. "Still here, sweetheart." His voice carried across the cafeteria. "Thought you'd have run home by now." He reached out, a casual gesture, the kind a man makes when he knows nobody will stop him, and knocked her tray to the floor. The plastic plate clattered first, then the silverware screamed across tile, soup splashing in an arc that caught the edge of her scrubs. The cafeteria fell silent the way rooms do when someone crosses a line they didn't know existed. Laura stood slowly, watching the puddle spread like something alive. One tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling. No trembling. No flinch. Just the steady hand of someone who had held worse than shame. Sterling pulled Marcus's chart from under his arm and threw it at her feet, papers scattering like confetti at a funeral. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's what nurses do, right? Clean up messes." His voice had the quality of a tank idling in a garage, all engine, no direction. Laura bent, gathering the pages with steady hands. The chart pages were still warm from his grip. She straightened slowly, papers assembled back in order, and met his eyes with a kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I've held dying men together with my bare hands, doctor," she said. Her voice was desert dry. "I think I can handle a clipboard." The silence stretched. Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. Big words for someone who'll be gone by Friday. He walked away before she could respond, the kind of tactical retreat that felt like victory only to him. A resident who'd witnessed everything stared into her coffee. Nobody else looked up. Commander Hayes appeared in the cafeteria doorway a moment later, having heard the exchange from the hallway. His face was unreadable, the composure of a man trained to absorb damage without flinching. He watched Laura for 3 seconds, watching her breathe, watching her gather the scattered remains of her dignity. Then he turned back toward his son's room without saying a word. But something had shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Laura finished mopping the cafeteria floor herself, her hand steady even as something inside her fractured quietly, the way ice breaks beneath weight you can't see coming. That evening she drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel too hard, her knuckles white against the black leather. The drive from Oak Creek Memorial to her apartment in Savannah took 17 minutes on Route 17, and she counted every one of them, each mile a small victory just for existing. Her 8-year-old daughter Emily was waiting on the couch when she arrived, the babysitter gathering her things. "Mommy!" Emily launched herself at Laura's legs. Laura scooped her up, breathing in her daughter's strawberry shampoo, pressing her face into the curve of Emily's shoulder. In that moment she could pretend the day hadn't happened, that no one had thrown anything at her feet, that she wasn't slowly being erased from a job she was actually saving lives in. But the illusion only held for so long. After Emily was asleep, Laura sat at the kitchen table in the dark, still in her scrubs. The fabric smelled like soup and antiseptic and failure. She pulled out the small wooden box from her dresser, the one Emily had never seen, and opened it. Inside was a faded Coast Guard unit patch, sewn from a jacket that no longer existed. She ran her thumb across the thread work, each stitch a memory of who she used to be before Marjah, before the screaming woke her at 3 a.m., before she decided that disappearing was the only way to survive. Her phone buzzed on the table. An email from the hospital's credentialing office. "We need to verify your employment history. Please provide documentation of your previous positions and references. Copy the hospital attorney. Copy the director of nursing. Copy Dr. Sterling." The next morning, Laura moved through the pediatric ward with the same quiet efficiency, but the staff moved around her like water around a stone, present but separate. She'd reviewed Marcus's file at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, and noticed something that made the back of her neck go cold. All 10 consulting physicians. 6 of them shared office space with Apex Medical Solutions. All 6 had listed identical recommendations for withdrawal of support, using nearly identical language. Boilerplate, not clinical assessment. She pulled up the hospital supply records. Apex Medical Solutions was the primary vendor for ventilators, cardiac monitors, and ICU equipment. The billing cycle aligned perfectly. High turnover in critical beds meant more equipment sales. Marcus wasn't a patient to these men. He was a billing cycle. A bed that needed to empty so the next one could fill it. In the break room at 11:24 a.m., she overheard Sterling on the phone, his voice low but not low enough. "The Hayes bed needs to turn over by month end," he said. "Equipment supplier needs the billing cycle closed." Pause. "I'm handling the nurse." "Won't be an issue." Laura stood frozen, the coffee pot suspended in her hand. The carafe was still warm, steam rising in thin lines. She set it down carefully, every movement controlled, and walked back to Marcus's room. Her hands wanted to shake. She didn't let them. That afternoon, Sterling made his move. He called the hospital's credentialing investigator, a woman named Patricia Reeves who'd worked in medical credentials for 19 years. "We have a new nurse in pediatrics," he told her. "Laura Bennett. Something's off about her background. She won't say where she worked before Oak Creek. I need everything you have on her. Every license, every employment gap." He also called a board member, Dr. James Kellerman, an old friend. "New nurse, questionable background, refuses to provide a clear employment history. I'm concerned about her credentials. Thought you should know." By 3 p.m., staff began avoiding Laura's eyes. At 3:45 p.m., Commander Hayes found her in the medication room, checking Marcus's evening medications against the chart. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" His voice was careful, measured. She couldn't answer. What could she say? That the life she'd built on anonymity was being dismantled by a man who saw her compassion as an obstacle? That the person she'd been, the one who'd served, who'd survived Marjah, who'd held dying men in her arms, couldn't exist in this building without destroying the person she'd become? "I'm fine, sir," she said. It wasn't true. The next day, the hospital's credentialing office called her into a conference room. Patricia Reeves sat across from her with a folder open. "We're having trouble verifying your employment history," Reeves said gently. "Can you explain the gaps? You list work in Montana from 2015 to 2016, then nothing until you applied here 6 months ago." Laura's phone kept ringing that evening, the credentialing office asking for documentation, asking for explanations, asking for proof that she was who she claimed to be. At home, Emily asked, "Mommy, why does your phone keep ringing?" Laura had no answer. She stared at the faded unit patch in her drawer, the one she'd sewn into Marcus's jacket lining during a quiet moment, the one she'd whispered Semper Paratus over like a prayer. That was the life she'd walked away from. The Coast Guard. The rank. The medal she'd never mentioned. Marjah had left her waking up screaming, had given her PTSD that clawed at her in dark rooms, had made her decide that anonymity was the only medicine that worked. Telling anyone, even her daughter, felt like admitting the PTSD had already won. But not telling anyone meant she had no defense against someone like Sterling. No credentials they couldn't attack. No authority they couldn't question. Just a nurse with gaps in her history and a daughter waiting at home and the terrifying, suffocating certainty that she was about to lose everything again. Day 3 of Marcus Hayes' hospitalization began like every other shift, the mechanical hiss of the ventilator, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the antiseptic smell that never quite masked the underlying presence of human fragility. Laura arrived at 6:06 a.m., 17 minutes before her official shift start, moving through the pediatric ward with a quiet efficiency that had become her armor. Her scrubs were pressed. Her badge hung at exactly the correct angle. Everything about her screamed unremarkable. She pulled the chart for room for 12. All 10 consulting physicians' reports were stacked in the electronic system like a deck of identical cards. Dr. Sterling's name appeared on the first consultation, a neurological assessment completed on arrival plus 4 hours, recommendation for immediate DNR discussion. Then came Dr. Reeves from neurosurgery, nearly identical language, same conclusion, same urgency. Dr. Chow from critical care. Dr. Weber from trauma. 8 more names she didn't recognize, each with their own institutional letterhead, each with the same devastating verdict rendered with the precision of rubber stamps. Laura sat in the break room with her coffee, black, no sugar, a habit from 17 years of deployments where sweetener meant wait, and wait meant slower, and began reading each report word by word. Not skimming. Reading. The kind of reading she'd been trained to do, the kind that caught inconsistencies in patrol reports and interrogation transcripts and military medical assessments. By the 3rd report, she noticed it. The exact same phrase, neurological prognosis, appears grave given significant hypoxic insult and current comatose state. Not similar phrasing. Identical. Word for word. Weber had copied Reeves. Or Reeves had copied Sterling. Or all 3 had copied from a template somewhere. The 4th report used slightly different words but arrived at the same conclusion in the same paragraph structure. The 5th report was nearly verbatim from Sterling's original assessment. A coffee cup sat on the table beside her, steam rising in thin ribbons. She didn't touch it. She kept reading. By the time she reached Dr. Feldman's consultation, the 9th opinion, the pattern had crystallized into something unmistakable. 10 physicians. 10 supposedly independent medical assessments. 10 identical conclusions. 10 identical recommendations. The probability of that was 0. The statistical impossibility of it was staring at her from the screen like a confession written in plain text. She had just finished reading Feldman's report when the break room door swung inward and Dr. Sterling walked through, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried the particular tone of a man having a conversation he believed was private, the kind of tone that made people forget they weren't alone. "I understand the equipment timeline," he said, moving toward the refrigerator as if the room were empty. "But we're looking at a 7-bed bottleneck in pediatric critical care through the end of the fiscal quarter. The Hayes case alone is consuming one of our highest acuity beds." A pause. He pulled out a lunch container that smelled like expensive deli meat and aged cheese. "Yes, I'm aware of the per consult rate. $1,200 per consultation, and I've got documentation for all 10. Another pause, longer this time. Laura could hear the tinny voice on the other end of the line, indecipherable but animated. The equipment supplier is contractual obligated to manage turnover expectations on their end. They want the bed open, I want the bed open, and the family needs to understand that prolonging this only delays closure. Laura's hands remained absolutely still on the keyboard. The mother's still fighting. Sterling laughed, a sound like gravel in a tumbler. That's what the psych consults are for. Document her resistance as maternal denial, recommend a psychiatric evaluation, and by next week she'll be signing the paperwork herself. We've done this before. He bit into his sandwich. Chewed. Swallowed. No, I'm not concerned about liability. 9 physicians on record saying brain death. 1 civilian nurse's hunches don't create legal exposure. I'll handle the nursing staff if she becomes difficult. The line went dead, or he hung up, or the conversation simply ended the way conversations do when their purpose has been accomplished. Sterling didn't acknowledge that she was there. He didn't even glance in her direction as he walked back through the door, his sandwich in hand, his expression perfectly composed. Laura sat without moving for 62 seconds. She counted them. She had learned in combat that sometimes the most important moments happened in the space between stimulus and response, the gap where training took over and thought didn't interfere. She breathed. Once. Twice. 3 times. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the sound of pieces clicking into place with the terrible precision of a rifle being chambered. $1,200 per consultation. 10 consultations. $12,000 distributed among physicians who all used the same language, the same structure, the same conclusion. Equipment supply contracts and bed turnover and fiscal quarters. A kickback scheme so obvious it barely qualified as a scheme at all, just business being conducted with the simple brutality of people who believed no one was watching. She closed the break room door and returned to the chart room, pulling up the detailed medical records going back to Marcus's arrival. The CT scans from the emergency department showed moderate cerebral edema from the boating accident. The initial EEG showed some abnormal activity but nothing that suggested irreversible brain death. The spinal imaging was clear. The trauma panel was reassuring for a 10-year-old who had taken a significant impact to his head. Survivable. Serious, but survivable. Not brain dead. Not even close to brain dead. Laura opened her own documentation software and began writing a parallel assessment. Not a challenge to the other physicians, that would be suicide, that would trigger exactly the kind of institutional response that had already nearly destroyed her once before. Instead, she documented what she observed. Pupil reactivity. Corneal reflex response. Gag reflex present. Withdrawal to pain stimuli. Normal breathing pattern over the ventilator's settings. The reflexes of a boy who was profoundly unconscious, yes, but not neurologically deceased. Then she pulled up the vital signs trending from the past 48 hours and began comparing them to the physical examination she performed on day 1. Something was wrong with the numbers. The chest X-rays from admission showed clear lungs. The current films showed them still clear. The ventilator settings were minimal, essentially life support for a boy whose body was breathing beneath it. His oxygen saturation was holding at 97%. His heart rate was steady at 84 beats per minute, slightly elevated for sleep but not for a traumatized child. His blood pressure was. She went back to the monitors in his room. 112/68. That was what his cuff just showed. That was what his body was doing right now, at this very moment, at 7:14 a.m. on day 3. But 2 hours earlier, the shift notes documented a pressure of 98/52. Laura went directly to Marcus's room. Commander Hayes was asleep in the chair beside his son's bed, his head tilted back, his face drawn with the particular exhaustion that only came from sleeping in hospital furniture while your child lay comatose. She moved to the vital signs monitor, checking every single reading against the chart. The blood pressure cuff reinflated every 15 minutes on its automatic cycle. She waited. Watch the numbers appear. 113/69. She walked to the head of the bed, taking her stethoscope from her neck, warming the diaphragm against her palm. Old muscle memory, heat meant comfort, even for unconscious children. She pressed it to his chest, listening to the heart sounds. Clear. Bright. Distinct S1 and S2. No murmurs. No irregularities. A child's heart working exactly as children's hearts were meant to work, pumping oxygen to a brain that was not dead. Then she pivoted the stethoscope to listen to his lungs. Air moved bilaterally. Equal breath sounds, no consolidation, no wheezing. Normal. Everything about this boy's body was screaming normalcy, screaming survival, screaming that the 10 physicians' assessments were not just wrong but deliberately, systematically wrong. Find something. She turned. Commander Hayes was awake. His eyes were red-rimmed, his uniform wrinkled from sleeping in it, but his attention was focused with the precision of someone trained to read details in moments of crisis. Routine checks, Laura said, her voice level. Just routine. But she was already moving, already walking to the medication log, already beginning the process of understanding what exactly had been administered to this child and in what sequence. Because if 10 independent physicians were recommending the same death with identical language and identical reasoning, and if that recommendation was connected to equipment supplier kickbacks, then the question wasn't whether the assessment was wrong. The question was how deep the deception actually went. And that was when her phone vibrated. A text from the nursing supervisor, Dr. Sterling requesting you reassigned from Hayes' case. Available for shift reassignment conversation in office at 8 a.m. Do not approach patient without supervisor present. Laura looked at the message for 3 seconds. Then she went back to the bedside, pulled the faded Coast Guard unit patch from the inside of her scrubs, the one she'd carried for 6 years, the one she'd touched every morning like a prayer, and pressed it into Marcus's hand. Not the real patch. That was safe at home. This was a copy she kept for moments exactly like this, for moments when a child needed to carry something that meant someone, somewhere, had already decided they were worth saving. She didn't speak. Commander Hayes was watching. But she held Marcus's hand for exactly 4 seconds, and in that silence, she made a decision that would either save this boy's life or destroy what remained of her own. The shift supervisor was going to fire her. Sterling was going to burn her credentials. The hospital was going to protect its financial interests with the particular ruthlessness that institutions always used when their systems were threatened. But Marcus Hayes was not brain dead, and she had 17 years of combat medicine in her hands, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. Day 6. The monitors told Laura everything the moment she stepped into Marcus's room. His heart rate had climbed to 142 beats per minute, a steady, mounting panic she could hear in the electronic pulse of the machines. His blood pressure was dropping. 78/42 and falling. The numbers didn't lie. The 10 consulting physicians had all missed this, or worse, had seen it and ignored it. She moved to his bedside without hesitation. Her hands were already steady, already reading the story written across his small chest. Distended neck veins. That was the first sign, the jugular vein standing out like cords beneath the surface of his skin, engorged from pressure building inside his thoracic cavity. His breathing had become shallow, desperate, the kind of breathing that meant his lungs were competing for space with something else. Tamponade. Pericardial fluid compressing the chambers of his heart, squeezing the life out of him millimeter by millimeter. Laura's fingers pressed gently against Marcus's sternum, feeling for the pulsus paradoxus, the slight drop in blood pressure that happened with each inhale. There. She felt it. The textbook sign every resident learned and half of them forgot to check for in real practice. Her jaw clenched once, then went still. This boy had been lying in this hospital for 6 days while 10 doctors had written identical reports declaring him brain dead. While they'd called his father and told him to say goodbye. While they'd scheduled consultations with equipment suppliers about which machines to discontinue. Not one of them had checked for fluid in the pericardium. She reached for the crash cart, muscle memory, not thought. Her hands moved on their own, the kind of movement that came from holding dying men together with fingers and gauze and prayer across 3 continents. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile field. Her movements were precise, economical, the opposite of panicked even though Marcus's oxygen saturation was dropping in real time. 94%. 91. 88. The resident who'd been charting at the bedside froze. Laura could feel his eyes on her, could sense the moment his medical school training connected with what he was witnessing. The way she'd prepped the site. The angle of her body. The absolute absence of hesitation. This wasn't a civilian nurse performing a procedure. This was someone who'd done this before, not in controlled hospital settings with backup standing by, but in conditions where backup was a distant memory and hesitation meant watching people die. She didn't acknowledge him. There was no time for explanations, no bandwidth for the story her hands were telling the room. The needle slid through the skin just below the xiphoid process, angled toward Marcus's left shoulder, moving through the chest wall with a kind of gentle confidence that came from having done it in the dark. In the rain. Under fire. The hiss of air escaping. That beautiful, terrible sound of pressure releasing. Straw-colored fluid, serous fluid, not blood, which meant infection, inflammation, but not hemorrhage. She could work with this. The fluid that was crushing Marcus's heart flowed into the syringe like mercy. 15 milliliters. 30. 50. His oxygen saturation began climbing. 92. 95. 98. The monitors shifted their tone, the panic draining from their electronic voices as his body suddenly had room to breathe again. His heart rate was dropping. His blood pressure was rising. On the screen above his head, the rhythm that had been erratic and desperate began organizing itself back into something that looked like survival. Laura pulled the unit patch from inside her scrub pocket, the faded insignia, worn soft from years of being held close to skin during long nights. Semper Paratus. Always ready. She pressed it into Marcus's small hand, closing his fingers around it the way she'd held the hands of 12-year-old interpreter in Helm and Province who'd taken shrapnel and lived. The way she'd held her own daughter's hand at 3 in the morning when the nightmares woke her. Some prayers didn't need words. "You're okay," she whispered to the boy whose father was a commander, whose father had once led her unit, whose father didn't know yet that she'd just pulled his son back from the place she'd been trying to leave behind. "You're going to be okay." The resident was already moving toward the door. She heard his footsteps accelerate, heard him calling out in the hallway for an attending, for supervisors, for someone to witness what had just happened. Within minutes, the room would fill with people. Questions. The familiar machinery of institutional concern grinding to life now that the emergency had passed. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours later, after Marcus had been moved to the ICU, after his vitals had stabilized, after the preliminary imaging confirmed that the pericardiocentesis had been necessary and life-saving, Dr. Sterling made a phone call from his office on the 3rd floor. Laura heard about it third-hand, the way hospital gossip moved, whispered between a phlebotomist and a respiratory therapist in the break room. Sterling had called the credentialing investigator. His voice had been urgent, outraged, the voice of a physician shocked to discover dangerous incompetence among his staff. Unauthorized invasive procedure, he'd said. Patient endangered. This nurse performed a procedure outside her scope of practice without physician order or supervision. "I'm filing a formal complaint. I want an immediate review." The credentialing investigator listened and took notes. By the end of the shift, Laura found herself summoned to the administrative office on the 2nd floor. The investigator sat across from her, a thin man with glasses and a closed folder on the desk in front of him. Sterling stood in the corner, his expression carefully neutral, the expression of a concerned colleague who'd merely been doing his duty to protect patients. "We have concerns," the investigator said, opening the folder. "Significant gaps in your employment history. You've worked at 5 different hospitals in 3 states over the past 7 years. No reasons given for any of the transitions. No references that go back more than 18 months. Laura said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. More concerning is what happened today, he continued. Dr. Sterling reports that you performed an invasive cardiac procedure without direct supervision or physician order. A pericardiocentesis. That's not within the scope of a registered nurse's independent practice. The child's heart was failing, Laura said quietly. His oxygen saturation was 85%. His blood pressure was 72 systolic. He had 2 minutes. Possibly less. That's a decision for physicians to make, the investigator said. Not nurses. The physicians weren't in the room. Sterling spoke then, his voice soft with the kind of concern that sounded rehearsed. I've been trying to support Laura, but there are patterns here we can't ignore. The unauthorized procedures, the gaps in her background, and frankly, some of the medication administration records from her earlier shifts show inconsistencies that are troubling. None of it was true. Laura could have called him on it. Could have pointed out that he'd been in the hospital for the last 4 hours and had seen her medication administration, had seen it done correctly because she did everything correctly. Could have demanded to see these inconsistencies he was describing. Instead, she sat in that hard plastic chair and said nothing, because explaining meant opening doors she'd sealed shut 7 years ago. Explaining meant telling them about Marjah. About the 17-year-old girl who'd been caught in crossfire and bled out in her arms because the nearest hospital was 40 kilometers away and the roads were all IEDs. It meant admitting that she'd come to Oak Creek Memorial hoping to do nothing but listen to heart monitors and change dressings, that she'd come here running from the person she'd been, and that some wounds didn't have timelines and some trauma didn't respect your desire to disappear into the quiet. I have nothing further to say, Laura said. The investigator exchanged a glance with Sterling. We're placing you on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. You'll need to surrender your hospital badge and clear your locker by end of shift. HR will contact you within 48 hours regarding the formal process. She walked out of that office still holding her composure, walked down the hallway with the same steady pace she'd used to walk patrol routes in Kandahar, walked past the nurses' station where 3 colleagues looked up with expressions that had shifted from respect to something closer to suspicion. The machinery of institutional self-protection was already grinding to life, already rewriting the narrative to protect its own. That evening she came home 3 hours early, still in her scrubs, and sat at the kitchen table in her small house in Savannah while the light outside turned amber and then purple and then the dark blue of autumn rain. Her daughter Emily found her there at 6:30, still in those scrubs, still holding the coffee mug she'd carried from the hospital break room out of pure habit. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Emily's voice was small, uncertain. "Did someone get sick?" Laura pulled her daughter against her chest and couldn't explain that she'd saved a boy's life and been destroyed for it, couldn't explain that she'd been running from herself for so long that even doing the right thing couldn't catch her anymore. She just held Emily and listened to the rain. The next morning, Sterling handed her the termination letter at the nurse's station. Commander Derek Hayes was there, Marcus's father, standing in the hallway outside his son's ICU room, and he watched as the woman who'd brought his child back from the edge was escorted out by security. Laura carried the box containing her coffee mug, a photo of Emily, and the unit patch she'd worn against her skin for 7 years. Through the lobby. Past the front desk. Into the parking lot where the rain was still falling, where her car waited like an escape route. She was loading the box into her trunk when the sound hit her first, rotor wash, that particular percussion of helicopter blades cutting air into submission. Her hands froze. She didn't move as the HH-65 Dolphin descended onto Oak Creek Memorial's helipad, downdraft scattering debris across the parking lot in a wide arc of wind and noise and absolute authority. 6 Coast Guard officers in dress uniforms emerged from the aircraft, boots moving in synchronized precision toward the hospital entrance. The lead officer's voice cut through the wind, "We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett." Laura's breath stopped. She stood motionless at her open trunk, the box still in her hands, watching as the 6 uniformed figures strode through the lobby doors, their presence shifting something fundamental in the air pressure of the building itself. The rain continued falling. Inside the hospital, heads turned. Sterling's face would have gone white. Commander Hayes would have understood what that uniform meant, what that call sign meant, what it meant that Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett was being summoned not as a suspect, but as someone important enough that the Coast Guard had sent an aircraft. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial's administrative corridor hummed their monotonous frequency as Dr. Sterling moved through his domain like a man orchestrating a symphony only he could hear. His office door clicked shut behind him at 4:36 p.m., the city of Savannah bleeding orange light through the windows as he reached for his phone. The screen glowed with the names of 7 board members, each one carefully cultivated over years of dinner invitations and country club connections. He dialed the first number. His voice, when it came, carried the smooth precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Yes, hello, Gerald. Sterling here. I wanted to reach out about our pediatric ward crisis." The words that followed were chosen with surgical precision: unauthorized procedures, patient endangerment, a nurse who had overstepped her authority and nearly caused irreversible harm. The woman in question, she performed an invasive intervention without consulting senior physicians. She's reckless. She's a liability. Each board member heard nearly identical language, each one receiving the same urgent tone, the same implication that swift action was necessary to protect the hospital's accreditation. Sterling hung up and moved to his second call. Then his third. By 6:15 p.m., the narrative had been planted in 7 different conversations, growing like a virus through the hospital's nervous system. The next morning, Sterling sat across from a credentialing investigator in a windowless office on the basement level of Oak Creek Memorial, his expression arranged into concerned helpfulness. "I'd like to help you understand her background," he said smoothly. "The references she provided are limited. Vague. I have contacts at 3 prior facilities. Let me connect you." What he didn't mention was that those contacts, 2 hospital administrators and a clinic director, had each received calls the previous evening. "You'll want to ask about her credentials specifically," Sterling continued, leaning forward with the practiced concern of a man expressing worry for a colleague. "Her military background, if she actually has one. These things warrant scrutiny." He handed over a folder containing photocopied disciplinary reports, their language carefully constructed to suggest systemic problems rather than isolated incidents. Each page bore his signature. None of them reflected what had actually occurred. By 8:27 a.m., investigators had opened a formal file on Laura Bennett. The phone calls continued. Hospital security received a request to pull surveillance footage from the pericardiocentesis scene. The credentialing office received anonymous tips about military discharge records, about possible falsified certifications, about a nurse who might not be who she claimed to be. Rumors moved through the nursing staff like water seeping through cracks. "Did you hear about Laura? Did you know she might be lying about her background? Has anyone actually verified her credentials?" The investigation that Sterling had triggered was designed to accomplish one goal: make Laura Bennett disappear from the narrative, rewrite her as a fraud, a danger, someone whose heroism could be reframed as recklessness. It was elegant work. It was thorough. It was the work of a man who had learned that authority is an instrument, and institutions protect their own. Sterling had spent 15 years learning how to make people vanish. Now he was doing it to the one person who might stop him. Laura arrived at her apartment at 2:53 p.m. on a Wednesday, still wearing her scrubs, the fabric damp with a nervous sweat that no amount of clinical training teaches you to suppress. She had been pulled aside by the credentialing director that morning. Informal questions at first about her previous experience, her certifications, whether she had actually served in any capacity before Oak Creek Memorial. The questions had grown more pointed as the conversation continued. By the time she was allowed to leave, she understood someone was dismantling her. Someone was reaching into the careful boxes where she had stored her identity and scattering the contents across an institutional floor. Her hands trembled as she set her bag on the kitchen table, not from fear, but from the specific kind of rage that comes from watching your carefully constructed safety net catch fire. Her daughter Emma found her there, sitting motionless in a kitchen chair, still in scrubs, the afternoon light making the room feel like it was underwater. Emma was 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and a sensitivity to pain that no child should possess. "Mommy, why are you sad?" Did someone get sick? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Laura pulled her daughter against her chest and held her while tears moved down her face, not the quiet, composed tears of a trained warrior, but the raw, gasping tears of a mother watching her carefully constructed life collapse. She had built this life in pieces. A studio apartment in Savannah. A good job. A school for Emma where nobody knew her name meant anything. A whole existence designed to be ordinary, to be invisible, to be safe. And it was crumbling in real time. The next morning arrived with the heaviness of inevitability. Laura stood in the hallway outside Marcus's room, her shift scheduled to begin in 4 minutes, when Dr. Sterling approached with a manila envelope in his hand. Commander Hayes sat vigil in a chair just visible through the glass of room 304, his son's monitors beeping their steady rhythm in the background. Sterling's timing was deliberate, his voice pitched to carry. Senior Chief Bennett, I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending investigation into your credentials and the unauthorized medical procedures performed on this patient. He extended the termination letter. Hospital policy requires immediate removal of your access credentials and discharge from the premises. His eyes held a glimmer of something that might have been satisfaction. Behind him, 2 security officers stood with the posture of men trained to move bodies out of buildings. Commander Hayes rose from his chair with the slow precision of a man understanding, in real time, that he was witnessing betrayal. His hand moved toward the glass, but he didn't push through. He had learned in command that sometimes moving too quickly can escalate the situation. Instead, he watched as the 2 security officers escorted Laura, the woman who had saved his son's life, down the corridor toward the administrative wing. Laura didn't resist. She didn't argue. She moved with the composure of someone who had survived worse than this, because she had. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sterile white glow that made the moment feel like it was happening behind reinforced glass, like watching a catastrophe on a monitor in a tactical center. Sterling watched her go, his expression already moving on to the next task, the next phone call, the next carefully orchestrated destruction. The parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial stretched out under a sky the color of weathered concrete. Laura's car sat in the employee section, a 2009 Honda Civic with a rust spot near the rear bumper and a child's booster seat visible through the back window. A security guard, an older man named Rodriguez who had smiled at her twice in 7 months, handed her a cardboard box containing her personal effects. Her stethoscope. A photo of Emma in a frame. The book she'd been reading during lunch breaks. Her locker had been emptied in less than 10 minutes. I'm sorry, Rodriguez said quietly, his eyes not meeting hers. She didn't respond. What was there to say to a man following orders in a system larger than both of them? Laura set the box in the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Through the windshield, she could see the hospital rising behind her like a fortress. Somewhere inside, Marcus was waking up. Somewhere inside, his father was learning that the nurse who had pulled his son back from the edge of death had just been erased from the building. Somewhere inside, Dr. Sterling was taking his next phone call, already thinking about how to manage the narrative, how to ensure that when this ended, and it would end, his version of events would be the one recorded in official documents. She sat motionless in the car, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, breathing with the methodical control of someone who had done this before. Not this exactly. But something equivalent. The feeling of watching a plan disintegrate. The weight of knowing that your best wasn't good enough. The understanding that sometimes the institution wins. What she didn't see, couldn't have seen from the parking lot, was the movement in the sky above Oak Creek Memorial. The sound started as a distant hum, the kind of vibration that hospital staff learn to identify without looking up. Rotor blades cutting through Savannah air. Laura's hands gripped the steering wheel harder. The hum grew louder, the distinctive sound of a helicopter that moved with the purpose of a predator, not the casual drift of air traffic monitoring the city. It circled once, the aircraft's body catching sunlight like a blade, then descended toward the helipad on the hospital's roof. Laura couldn't see it from the parking lot. She didn't know that 6 uniformed officers had boarded that aircraft at 9:06 a.m. from a Coast Guard installation 90 miles away. She didn't know that they carried documents, legal authorizations, and the specific kind of authority that made hospital administrators answer their questions without argument. She was already reaching for her ignition key when her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. The text came from a number she didn't recognize. Just 3 words, "Don't leave yet." She read it twice, her military training activating the small part of her brain that had learned to recognize when something larger than the immediate situation was moving into position. Behind the hospital, the helicopter's rotors continued their steady beat. Inside the lobby, Dr. Sterling was about to learn that his careful orchestration of authority meant nothing when the actual authority arrived. And in the parking lot, Laura Bennett sat in a 7-year-old Honda and understood, in that moment, that her sacrifice, the silent suffering, the hidden identity, the willingness to be erased, had not gone unnoticed by forces operating far beyond Sterling's institutional reach. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story moved you, subscribe to see the full identity reveal and watch as one woman's hidden past collides with her present. And tell me in the comments, would you have walked away, or would you have fought to stay? Like this video, and let me know.